There are certain kinds of pain that don't announce themselves with screams. They arrive in silence, in a garden thick with moonblooms and wolfsbane, in the space between one heartbeat and the devastation of the next. Dorcas Ashwood had spent 7 years preparing for heartbreak. She just never imagined it would feel like dying. The Alpha King's words still hung in the air between them, sharp as silver through flesh. You have to leave. For words. Simple. Final. Delivered without the mercy of hesitation, without the softness she'd foolishly let herself imagine might exist somewhere beneath that granite exterior. The medicinal garden spun around her, every carefully tended herb bed she'd nurtured for 7 years suddenly foreign, suddenly belonging to a life that was no longer hers. The night air pressed against her skin, thick and suffocating despite the autumn chill, carrying the scent of impending rain and something darker, something that tasted like the end of everything. Dorcas had known this moment would come. She'd seen it in her nightmares, felt it creeping closer with each passing day as the bonding ceremony approached. But knowing and experiencing are separated by a chasm so wide that all her preparation meant nothing now. Her knees wanted to buckle. Her wolf, that poisoned, suppressed, barely their presence she'd spent 7 years slowly killing, whimpered somewhere deep in her chest, a sound only she could hear. A sound that might have been please or perhaps goodbye. Theron stood 3 feet away, close enough that she could see the muscle ticking in his jaw, close enough that his scent wrapped around her like a betrayal of its own. Pine and smoke and something wild that her broken wolf still recognized despite everything she'd done to sever that recognition. He was beautiful in the moonlight, beautiful in the way dangerous things often are, all sharp edges and controlled power. His eyes, that particular shade of amber that haunted her sleeping and waking hours, reflected no recognition of what this was doing to her. Or perhaps he simply didn't care. The promise he'd made 7 years ago might as well have been ash on the wind. You'll always have a place in my kingdom. Always. She'd believed him. Moon above, she'd believed him with every fiber of her being, believed it enough to stay when she should have run, believed it enough to poison herself slowly, methodically, to suppress a mate bond he'd never even felt because she'd made certain he wouldn't. Because loving him meant protecting him, even from herself. Especially from herself. Her fingers trembled as she gripped the stone edge of the herb bed behind her, the rough surface grounding her when everything else felt like it was slipping away. Beneath her touch, the plants responded, a subtle pulse of life force that most wouldn't notice, but Dorcas felt everything. It was her gift and her curse, this heightened sensitivity to the threads of life and death that wove through all living things. Right now, those threads screamed warnings she couldn't afford to hear. The silver-leaf nightshade behind her left shoulder pulsed with a darkness that meant death was close. Not hers, never hers, despite how many times she'd wished otherwise over the past 7 years. Someone in the palace would not see dawn. She knew this the way she knew her own name, the way she'd known about the poisoned wine 2 springs ago, the assassination attempt during the winter hunt, the cursed blade that would have found Theron's heart if she hadn't switched it with a replica. 7 years of silent interventions. 7 years of saving a man who never knew he needed saving. 7 years of loving someone who looked at her now like she was a problem to be solved, an inconvenience to be removed. Lady Alara knows about your obsession. He'd said it so clinically, as if her heart wasn't shattering with each syllable. She's demanded your banishment. I have no choice. Obsession. The word rattled in her skull like a death knell. Is that what he thought this was? 7 years of selfless, silent devotion reduced to something sick and twisted, something that deserved exile? Her tongue had gone numb, her throat closed around words that wanted to claw their way out, the truth, the prophecy, the mate bond, everything she'd sacrificed to keep him safe. But speaking would doom them both. Speaking would set in motion events that ended with his death and her transformation into something monstrous, something the old prophecy had whispered about in her dreams every night since she'd first touched his hand and felt the bond snap into place. The Omega who loves the Alpha King will be the blade that ends his reign. So she'd stayed silent. She'd learned to swallow words the way she swallowed the poison-laced tea every morning, the bitter herbs that weakened her wolf, that made the mate bond a ghost of what it should have been, that slowly drained her life force year by year. The palace physicians, her mentors, the wolves who'd taken her in when Theron found her dying in the woods, they thought her pallor and weakness came from overwork, from an Omega constitution too fragile for the demanding apprenticeship. They had no idea she was killing herself to save a king who would one day tell her to leave without a flicker of regret in his eyes. The rain began then, as if the sky itself couldn't hold back anymore. Fat drops that landed cold against her upturned face, mixing with tears she refused to acknowledge. Theron didn't move, didn't offer shelter or comfort, just stood there like a statue carved from stone and duty. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled, a low, ominous sound that vibrated through her bones and made every herb in the garden shudder. The wolfsbane to her right released its toxic perfume, stronger in the rain, and Dorcas breathed it in like a familiar friend. She'd built up an immunity over the years. She'd had to, working with so many poisons, preparing so many contingencies. Her vision blurred, and not from the rain. The exhaustion she'd been fighting for months crashed over her all at once, the cumulative effect of 7 years of self-inflicted poisoning, of suppressing a bond that fought her every day, of using her death sense gift over and over until it had worn grooves into her soul. She'd given everything to keep him alive, to keep him safe from the prophecy, to protect him from a fate that involved her. And this was her reward. Exile. Dismissal. The breaking of a promise that had kept her breathing through the darkest nights. I was young and foolish, he'd said, and something in his voice had almost sounded like regret. Almost. You were never meant to stay forever. But she had stayed. 7 years of forever, believing in a promise, believing in him. Believing that maybe, just maybe, if she loved him perfectly enough from the shadows, if she kept him safe without asking for anything in return, it would be enough. That she would be enough. What a fool she'd been. What a beautiful, broken, desperate fool. The garden path beckoned behind her, leading away from this moment, away from him, away from the only home she'd known since he'd carried her broken body out of those woods 7 years ago. She should turn. She should walk away with whatever dignity she had left, accept this exile, disappear into the night like the ghost she'd already been. It would be easier. Safer. The prophecy couldn't unfold if she wasn't here, if she put distance between them, if she let him bond with Alara and unite the packs and fulfill whatever political destiny required her removal. But even as that logical thought formed, something else stirred beneath her skin. Her wolf, that poisoned, suppressed, nearly destroyed piece of herself, suddenly surged against the barriers she'd built. Not with the weak whimpers she'd grown accustomed to, but with a fury that stole her breath. After 7 years of docile acceptance, of letting Dorcas slowly kill them both, the wolf chose now to fight back. The timing couldn't be worse. Or perhaps it was perfect. Perhaps the wolf knew what Dorcas had been trying to ignore. The mate bond, weakened as it was, suddenly flared hot in her chest, a searing, impossible heat that had no right to exist after everything she'd done to destroy it. And with that heat came knowledge that crashed through her mental shields like lightning through old wood. Death. Not the distant death she'd sensed in the nightshade, but something vast and terrible, connected to threads she'd been too focused on Theron to notice. Threads that led to Alara. Threads that pulsed with a wrongness that made Dorcas's stomach turn. How had she missed it? How had she been so blind, so focused on suppressing the bond and protecting Theron from the prophecy that she'd failed to see the real threat standing right beside him? The readings she'd dismissed as pre-bonding nerves, the strange energy fluctuations in the palace, the way certain wolves had started looking hollow around the eyes, it clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Blood magic. Life force siphoning. And it all centered around Alara. Around the woman Theron would bond within 3 days. Around the woman who demanded Dorcas's exile. The world tilted. Dorcas gripped the herb bed harder, her nails digging into ancient stone. She'd thought staying close was the danger. She'd thought she was the weapon the prophecy warned about. But what if she'd been wrong? What if her silence, her sacrifice, her careful distance had been playing directly into someone else's design? The rain fell harder, soaking through her simple apprentice robes, plastering her dark hair against her face. Theron finally moved, a slight shift that might have been impatience or discomfort. He wanted this over. Wanted her gone. Had probably already forgotten the girl he'd saved, the promise he'd made, the way she looked at him with such desperate gratitude that night 7 years ago. Fine. Let him forget. Let him think her obsessed and dismiss her like yesterday's correspondence. But she couldn't leave. Not yet. Not until she understood what Alara was, what she wanted, how deep this corruption ran. Even if it meant breaking her own heart more completely than it was already broken. Even if it meant risking the prophecy. Even if it meant Theron would never know, never understand, never see her as anything but the pathetic Omega who couldn't let go. Because loving him had never been about being seen. It had been about keeping him alive. And he was walking toward his own destruction wearing a crown and calling it duty. Dorcas lifted her chin, meeting his gaze through the rain. Let him see whatever he expected to see, hurt, anger, obsession. She'd spent 7 years being invisible. She could manage one more performance. One more sacrifice. One more silence. But this time, the silence wouldn't be surrender. It would be strategy. This time, she'd save him whether he wanted her to or not. And if the prophecy came for them both in the end, well, some fates were worth running toward instead of away from. The thunder rolled again, closer now, and somewhere in the medicinal garden, the silverleaf nightshade released another warning pulse. Death was coming. The only question was whose. If you're already feeling the ache in your chest, if you need to know what happens when love meets prophecy and silence becomes the most dangerous weapon of all, subscribe to Cindy's Wolfheart stories. Because we're just getting started. Dorcas made it as far as the North Tower before her legs gave out. Not from weakness, though the goddess knew 7 years of self-poisoning had left her body a fragile shell of what an Omega should be. No, this collapse came from something far more devastating than physical exhaustion. It came from the sudden, overwhelming realization that she had nowhere to go. No pack to return to. No family waiting with open arms. Nothing beyond these palace walls except the memory of blood and screaming and a village that had called her cursed before she'd seen her 14th winter. The stone floor was cold against her palms, rain-soaked robes clinging to her frame as she knelt in the shadowed corridor. Somewhere below, the palace hummed with preparation for the bonding ceremony, 3 days until Theron would tie himself to Alara, until whatever dark design that blood witch had planned would crystallize into something Dorcas couldn't prevent from the outside. 3 days to figure out how to save a man who'd just banished her. 3 days to unravel a conspiracy she'd been too focused on martyrdom to see coming. The bitter irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent 7 years orchestrating rescues from the shadows, manipulating circumstances and potions and palace logistics to keep Theron alive, and she'd never once considered that the real danger might be something she'd welcome into his bed. That he'd welcome. That the entire kingdom would celebrate as their salvation. Her death sense pulsed again, stronger now, insistent. The silverleaf nightshade's warning had followed her from the garden, clinging to her awareness like a second shadow. Someone would die tonight. Multiple someones. Actually, the sensation had that peculiar multiplicity that meant violence, meant attack, meant the kind of chaos that left bodies in its wake. Her gift had never been wrong. Not once in 7 years. Not once in the 21 years she'd been alive and cursed with this knowing. She should warn someone. Should alert the palace guards, should send word to the Alpha King's personal security. Should do what she'd always done, intervene invisibly, protect from the periphery, save the day without ever being seen. But her hands wouldn't move. Her body had simply stopped. As if 7 years of constant vigilance had finally drained the last reserves she didn't know she'd been running on. As if being dismissed, being called obsessed, being erased had severed some fundamental cord that had kept her upright and functioning. She knelt there in the shadows of the North Tower, shaking with cold and something that felt dangerously close to apathy, and for the first time since Theron had pulled her from those woods, she thought, let it happen. Let death come. Let the prophecy unfold. Let it all burn. The thought terrified her more than any vision of death ever had. Footsteps echoed in the corridor, heavy, purposeful, moving with the confidence of someone who owned every stone in this palace. Dorcas didn't need to look up to know who approached. She'd memorized the rhythm of his walk years ago, could identify him blind and deaf just from the way the air shifted around his presence. Alpha King Theron Blackthorn, coming to ensure his orders were followed. Coming to watch her leave. Coming to sever the last thread of the promise that had kept her tethered to hope. Except the footsteps stopped. Right beside her. Close enough that she could see the edge of his boots in her peripheral vision, fine leather already spotted with rain. He must have followed her from the garden. Must have tracked her through the palace like prey, making sure the inconvenient Omega actually departed. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Dorcas kept her eyes on the floor, on her own trembling hands, unwilling to look up and see whatever expression he wore. Pity would destroy her. Indifference would be worse. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a rough edge she'd never heard before, something that sounded almost like pain. Dorcas. Just her name. Not a command or dismissal, just her name. Spoken like he was testing the weight of it, like he'd said it 1,000 times in private and was only now acknowledging it aloud. The intimacy of it sent a shock through her system, made her wolf surge again against the barriers that were suddenly, horrifyingly unstable. You're still here. A statement, not a question. His shadow fell across her, blocking the dim torchlight. Of course she was still here. Where else would she be? She'd made it 100 feet from the garden before her body had staged a rebellion against her mind's command to run. 100 feet in 7 years. The mathematics of that failure was almost poetic. She forced herself to stand, forced her legs to lock and hold despite how badly they wanted to crumple. Pride was all she had left. She wouldn't grovel, wouldn't beg, wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing exactly how thoroughly he'd broken her. When she finally met his gaze, she made sure her expression revealed nothing but the cool professionalism she'd cultivated as the physician's apprentice. But Theron wasn't looking at her with the detached authority he'd wielded in the garden. His amber eyes held something fierce and conflicted, something that made him look almost tortured. His jaw was tight, a muscle jumping beneath tan skin. His hands were clenched at his sides, knuckles white with tension. This wasn't the composed king who delivered her exile. This was something rawer, more dangerous. There's something wrong, he said, and the words came out harsh, almost accusatory. I can feel it. Like a storm building under my skin. Dorcas's breath caught. No, this couldn't be happening. The mate bond was supposed to be suppressed, buried under 7 years of poison and force of will. He shouldn't be feeling anything, shouldn't be sensing the disturbance in the natural order that her breaking control was causing. Unless she'd finally poisoned herself to the point where the herbs no longer worked. Where her wolf was too damaged to be contained. Where the bond she'd spent 7 years suffocating was clawing its way to the surface whether she wanted it to or not. You need to leave the palace, Dorcas heard herself say, voice steadier than she had any right to expect. Tonight. Don't ask questions, just trust me and go. His eyes narrowed. Trust you? I don't even know you. The words hit like a physical blow, and something in her chest actually cracked. 7 years. She'd given him 7 years of silent devotion, of life-saving interventions, of sacrificing her own existence to preserve his. And he didn't even know her. Had never bothered to look close enough to see her. had reduced her to a role physician's apprentice, that quiet Omega girl, without ever wondering who she actually was. But before she could formulate a response that wouldn't reveal the howling devastation inside her, the death sense exploded into urgent warning. Not soon. Not approaching. Now. The window at the end of the corridor shattered inward, glass erupting in a deadly spray. Dorcas moved on instinct, 7 years of protecting him overriding every other consideration. She threw herself at Theron, her small frame colliding with his much larger one, momentum and surprise enough to knock him sideways as something whistled through the space where his head had been. A crossbow bolt, tipped with silver and something darker. Poison. The same poison she'd been consuming for years. She recognized the scent of it, but concentrated to a lethal dose. They hit the ground hard, Dorcas on top of the Alpha King in a tangle of limbs that would have been scandalous under any other circumstance. Above them, shadows poured through the broken window, not wolves, something else, something that stank of blood magic and corruption. Alara's work. Had to be. The timing was too perfect, the magic too familiar from the traces Dorcas had been sensing for weeks. Theron rolled them in one fluid motion, covering her body with his, protective instincts overriding the fact that he'd been planning to exile her. His arm bracketed her head, his weight pinning her to the cold stone, and for a heartbeat they were frozen like that, close enough that she could see the silver flecks in his amber eyes, close enough that the mate bond, already unstable, suddenly roared to life with enough force to steal the breath from her lungs. She felt the exact moment it hit him. The moment recognition crashed through whatever barriers his ignorance had built. His eyes went wide, pupils dilating, and a sound escaped his throat that might have been her name, or a curse, or a prayer. The bond snapped into place between them like a cord pulled taut, like lightning finding ground, like every cliché she'd ever rolled her eyes at suddenly made devastatingly real. You, he breathed, and the single word carried the weight of revelation and accusation, and something that sounded almost like anguish. But there was no time for this, no space for the conversation that needed to happen, because the shadow creatures were converging and death was singing its warning through every nerve in Dorcas's body. She shoved against his chest, immovable as a mountain, completely unmoved by her Omega strength. "Let me up," she gasped. "You have to let me up or we're both dead." For a suspended moment, she thought he'd refuse. Thought the shock of the mate bond would paralyze him, leave them both vulnerable to whatever attack came next. But Theron was a king before he was anything else, and kings didn't survive by freezing in crisis. He pulled her up with him, keeping his body between her and the threats, still protecting her even as she felt confusion and betrayal radiating down the bond he'd just discovered. The bond she'd hidden. The bond she'd nearly destroyed them both to suppress. The bond that was now broadcasting every emotion she'd kept locked away for 7 years, love and desperation and grief, and a self-loathing so profound it probably tasted like ash in his mouth. 3 shadow creatures circled them, forms not quite solid, magic holding them together in defiance of nature. Blood magic. Definitely Alara's signature. Dorcas could feel it now, could trace the threads of stolen life force that animated these abominations. Behind her, Theron's power gathered, the raw, crushing dominance of an alpha king preparing to defend his territory. His mate. The thought sent a hysterical laugh bubbling up in her throat. After 7 years of hiding, the bond reveals itself during an assassination attempt in a random corridor. The timing would have been funny if they weren't about to die. Except Dorcas had spent 7 years keeping Theron alive. 7 years studying every poison, every threat, every possible danger. 7 years becoming the palace's invisible guardian. And blood magic, for all its corrupted power, had weaknesses. Had vulnerabilities. Had specific counteragents she'd been synthesizing for months, without fully understanding why her instincts had demanded it. The vial was still in her pocket, she kept it close always, part of her physician's kit, the herbs and tinctures she never went anywhere without. Her fingers closed around the cool glass, and she met Theron's eyes one more time. "Trust me," she said, echoing his earlier denial back at him. "Even if you don't know me, trust me now." And before he could respond, before doubt could stop her, before the logical voice that had kept her silent for 7 years could intervene, Dorcas stepped around the Alpha King's protective stance and faced the monsters wearing the face of her doom. The village had called her cursed long before Dorcas understood what the word meant. As she faced down the blood magic constructs in the corridor, Theron's shock and fury pulsing down their newly revealed bond like a living thing, her mind splintered across time. Present and past overlapping, the way trauma always lurked beneath the surface of composure, waiting for crisis to drag it back into the light. The vial in her hand felt both solid and insubstantial, reality and memory blurring at the edges. She'd been 13 when the death sense had first manifested. Young enough to still believe adults would protect her. Old enough to know, even then, that some truths destroyed more than they saved. It had started with her grandmother. Sweet, patient Elena, who'd raised Dorcas after her parents had died in a territorial dispute, who'd taught her about herbs and healing, who'd braided her hair every morning and told her stories about the old times when Omegas were revered as seers and priestesses instead of dismissed as weak. Elena had been laughing one moment. Dorcas could still see it, the way sunlight had caught in her silver hair, and then something had shifted. Some fundamental thread had gone wrong in the tapestry of her life force, and Dorcas had felt it like a scream inside her skull. "Grandmother, something's wrong," she'd said, childish and terrified, grabbing Elena's hand. "Please, we need the healer. Something's wrong with your heart." But there had been no time. Elena had collapsed before they'd made it 3 steps, a heart that had beaten steady for 67 years simply stopping. The healer had arrived too late, had examined the body with professional detachment, had declared it a natural death. These things happened. The heart was a mystery. No one could have predicted it. Except Dorcas had predicted it. Had felt death's approach like storm clouds gathering. Had known with absolute certainty what was coming and had been powerless to stop it. The second time, she'd tried to warn them. Markel, the blacksmith, his life force flickering with the particular wrongness that meant accident, meant injury, meant violence. She'd run to his shop, breathless and afraid, begging him not to work that day, not to touch the forge. "Please, please just listen." He'd patted her head and called her a strange little thing and sent her home. 3 hours later, a support beam had collapsed and Markel had died with his skull crushed and Dorcas's warning still echoing in his widow's memory. After that, the whispers had started. Cursed. Death-touched. Omen. The child who knew when the Reaper was coming, who carried misfortune in her very presence. Never mind that she'd tried to help, tried to save them. Fear didn't care about intention. By the time she was 14, the village had stopped looking at her like a person and started looking at her like a problem to be solved. The pack elders had convened. She'd listened from outside the meeting hall, pressed against rough wood, heart hammering, and discussed what to do with an Omega whose gift was so unsettling. Some had argued for exile. Others for suppression, for binding her abilities with ritual magic that would cripple her wolf permanently. The kindest voices had suggested sending her to a distant pack, making her someone else's burden. In the end, fate had made the choice for them. The rogue attack had come on a moonless night, 20 wolves with nothing to lose and violence in their hearts. Dorcas had felt them coming hours before they'd breached the territory, had felt the death they carried like rot on the wind. She'd tried to warn the guards, tried to make them listen, but she was the cursed Omega girl, and they were trained warriors. Why would they believe her paranoid visions? 37 villagers had died that night. Men, women, children she'd grown up with. The guards who dismissed her warnings. The elders who debated her exile. All of them fallen to teeth and claws and the chaos of an attack no one had been prepared for. Except Dorcas had been prepared. She'd known. And when the rogues had cornered her in the healer's hut where she'd been desperately trying to save the wounded, when their leader had smiled with blood-stained teeth and reached for her throat, something inside her had broken open. Her wolf had manifested for the first time, not the gentle Omega creature she should have been, but something desperate and feral and burning with the need to survive. Power had erupted from her in a wave that sent the rogues flying, that made the very air crackle with energy she didn't understand. For a heartbeat, she'd felt invincible. For a heartbeat, she'd thought maybe she could save them after all. But power without control was just another form of destruction. The healer's hut had collapsed from the force of her unleashed ability, trapping the wounded she'd been trying to protect. By the time the pack's reinforcements had arrived and driven off the remaining rogues, Dorcas had been kneeling in the ruins with blood on her hands and body surrounding her, some killed by the rogues, others crushed in the collapse she'd caused. The survivors had looked at her with horror, with condemnation. The girl who'd known the attack was coming and failed to convince anyone. The girl whose uncontrolled power had killed the very people she'd been trying to save. Cursed, they'd called her. Dangerous. A weapon too volatile to keep. They'd beaten her savagely, not officially. Nothing that would stain the pack's honor, but a group of grieving, angry wolves who'd cornered her in the woods and made sure she understood she was unwelcome, unwanted, unforgiven. They'd left her broken and bleeding at the territory's edge, a clear message: leave or the next beating would be her last. She'd crawled into the forest and waited to die. 14 years old, every bone screaming with pain, her wolf retreating into traumatized silence. She'd pressed herself against a tree trunk and thought about how easy it would be to just let go. Let death claim her the way it had claimed everyone she'd ever tried to save. Stop fighting. Stop failing. Stop being the cursed thing that brought misfortune everywhere she went. That's where Theron had found her. He'd been young then, barely into his role as Alpha King, all raw power and untested authority. Returning from some diplomatic mission with his personal guard, cutting through the forest that bordered her former pack's territory. Later, he'd told her he'd smelled blood on the wind and investigated. Had expected to find an animal carcass, maybe a skirmish. Instead, he'd found a broken Omega girl who'd looked up at him with eyes that had already accepted death. She'd felt the mate bond snap into place the moment his hand had touched her forehead, checking for fever. That golden cord connecting her to him, fate's declaration that this stranger was hers and she was his. But Dorcas had been too young, too traumatized, too shattered to understand what it meant. She'd only known that his touch had felt like safety, like the first breath after drowning, like maybe death could wait a little longer. Theron had gathered her carefully, had murmured reassurances she'd barely heard, had carried her back to his palace without question. His personal physician, old Marcus, who'd become her mentor, had worked through the night to save her life. And when she'd finally woken 3 days later, weak and disoriented, Theron had been there. Had sat beside her bed despite having a kingdom to run, and had made her a promise. You'll always have a place in my kingdom. Always. She'd believed him with the desperate faith of a child who'd lost everything. Had clung to those words like a lifeline. Had never told him about the mate bond she'd felt. She'd been too young to bond properly anyway. The connection would need to be accepted consciously when she came of age. Had never explained the full extent of her death sense gift, had only mentioned she had a knack for healing and intuition. Because the prophecy had come that very first night. She'd dreamed it while hovering between life and death, had felt ancient power pressing down on her consciousness, had heard a voice that might have been the moon goddess, or might have been her own fear given form. The Omega who loves the Alpha King will be the blade that ends his reign. Dorcas had woken gasping, and had known with the same certainty as her death sense, the mate bond was a danger. Loving Theron would destroy him. She was cursed, had always been cursed, and now fate had tied her to someone who actually mattered, someone whose death would impact thousands. So she'd buried it. had apprenticed under Marcus, had learned everything she could about healing and poisons and how to manipulate herbs to achieve impossible results. Had discovered, through careful experimentation, that certain combinations could suppress the mate bond, could weaken her wolf enough that the connection became barely perceptible. Had started taking the poison-laced tea on her 18th birthday, when the bond should have solidified into something undeniable. 7 years of watching him from the shadows. 7 years of saving his life without him ever knowing. 7 years of loving him in silence because speaking would doom them both. 7 years of slow suicide to protect a man who'd just looked at her and said, "I don't even know you." The bitter irony was that he'd been right. He didn't know her. How could he? She'd made absolutely certain he wouldn't, had cultivated invisibility like an art form, had become the phantom guardian he never knew he needed. Dorcas Ashwood, the physician's apprentice. Quiet, competent, unremarkable. The girl who'd saved his life 19 times, she'd kept count, some masochistic part of her needing the tally, without him ever seeing her face. But he saw her now. She could feel his attention like a physical weight as she faced down the blood magic constructs, the bond between them raw and new and broadcasting emotions he had no context for. Confusion, anger, betrayal at the hidden connection. And underneath it all, something that felt dangerously close to recognition, as if some part of him had always known she was there, waiting in the wings, keeping him alive. The constructs lunged, and Dorcas let her body remember the desperate power that had manifested 7 years ago in a burning village. Let her death sense guide her movements as she uncorked the vial, as she spoke words of negation that Marcus had taught her, as she threw the counteragent into the center of the magical abominations. The effect was immediate and violent. The blood magic holding the constructs together shrieked, an actual sound, high and agonized, as the purifying tincture ate through corrupted bonds. The shadows writhed, dissolving into acrid smoke, and for a heartbeat, Dorcas saw Alara's face in the dissipating magic. Saw her perfect features twisted with rage, saw the promise of retribution. Then there was nothing but silence and the lingering stench of dark magic defeated. Dorcas swayed, exhaustion crashing over her. She'd used the last vial, the only one she'd synthesized, gambling everything on a theory about Alara's magic. Behind her, she felt Theron move, felt his hands catch her before her knees could buckle again. "Who are you?" he asked, and the question carried the weight of 7 years of blindness suddenly lifted. "Who are you really?" She could tell him the truth now. Could explain everything, the prophecy, the bond, the poison, the silent devotion. Could finally be seen after all this time invisible. But as she opened her mouth to answer, her death sense pulsed one final warning. The attack tonight had been a test, a probe. The real danger was still coming. Still circling. Still wearing the face of the woman Theron would bond to in 3 days. And Dorcas, for all her sacrifice, still had no idea how to stop it without becoming the very blade the prophecy had warned about. Theron didn't let go. His hands remained on Dorcas's shoulders, steadying her, grounding her, the heat of his touch burning through the rain-soaked fabric of her apprentice robes. The mate bond hummed between them, no longer the ghost of a connection she'd spent 7 years strangling, but a living, breathing thing that wrapped around her ribs and squeezed. She could feel his heartbeat as if it were her own. Could feel the storm of emotions churning through him, confusion and anger and a possessive instinct he didn't understand yet, hadn't had time to process. The questions still hung in the air. Who are you really? Dorcas couldn't look at him. Couldn't bear to see whatever expression those amber eyes held, accusation or betrayal or worse, the clinical assessment of a king evaluating a threat. So she focused instead on the dissipating smoke where the blood magic constructs had been, on the shattered window at the corridor's end, on anything except the man whose life she'd saved 19 times and whose heart she'd just broken by existing. Someone who needs to leave, she finally said, voice hoarse. Like you wanted. Like Alara demanded. His grip tightened. Ilara sent those things. Not a question. A statement delivered with the cold certainty of a king who'd just had his eyes open to treason. Yes. No point in lying now. The bond made deception nearly impossible anyway. He'd feel the dishonesty like discord in music, even if he didn't yet know how to read the connection between them. And you knew. Harder now, anger bleeding into his tone. You knew she was dangerous, and you didn't tell me. You let me plan a bonding ceremony with a blood witch. Let me tie the kingdom's future to a woman who just tried to have me killed. I didn't know. The words burst out before Dorcas could stop them, raw and desperate. Not until tonight, not until the garden when everything fell apart and my wolf. She cut herself off, but it was too late. The confession had already started, and after 7 years of silence, the truth wanted out like poison from a lanced wound. Theron moved around to face her, hands sliding from her shoulders to her arms, holding her in place, forcing her to meet his gaze. The corridor's torchlight cast harsh shadows across his features, making him look older, harder. Every inch the warrior king who'd united 3 packs through strategy and strength. Nothing soft about him except the way his thumbs unconsciously stroked against her sleeves, a gesture of comfort he probably didn't even realize he was making. Your wolf, he repeated. The bond I'm feeling right now, the connection that's making my skin feel too tight and my instincts scream at me to lock you somewhere safe. You've felt this for how long? Shame burned hot in her chest. Dorcas wanted to look away, but his gaze held her pinned more effectively than his hands. 7 years, she whispered. Since the night you found me. Since you carried me out of those woods. She watched the realization hit him, watched his expression cycle through disbelief and shock and something that looked almost like grief. 7 years. His voice had gone quiet, dangerous. You've known we were mates for 7 years, and you never said anything. Never gave any indication. Let me believe you were just Marcus's apprentice, just another Palace Omega. I had to. The words came out broken, pleading. Theron, there's a prophecy. I don't care about prophecies. He bit the words out like a curse. I care that my mate has been poisoning herself. He stopped abruptly, eyes widening as pieces clicked together. That's why you're so weak. Why you look half dead most days. Marcus always said you were frail, that your constitution couldn't handle the demands of the apprenticeship, but it wasn't that at all, was it? You've been suppressing the bond. Killing your wolf to hide from me. It wasn't a question, but Dorcas nodded anyway. Watched something like anguish flash across his face before he locked it down behind royal composure. The bond betrayed him, though. She could feel his pain like her own, the devastating hurt of knowing his mate had chosen slow suicide over claiming him. Why? The single word carried the weight of 7 years of loneliness she'd never let herself acknowledge. 7 years of watching him from the shadows while he'd searched for connection, for partnership, for someone to share the crushing burden of the crown. 7 years while she'd been right there, silent and invisible and dying by degrees. The tears came then, hot and unwelcome, tracking down her face despite every attempt to hold them back. Because loving you is going to kill you, she said, and her voice shattered on the words. The prophecy said the Omega who loves the Alpha King will be the blade that ends his reign. I saw it the first night, felt it like truth in my bones. Everything I touch turns to death, Theron. Everyone I try to save ends up destroyed. I couldn't, her breath hitched. I couldn't let that happen to you. Not to you. For a long moment, he just stared at her, processing. Fitting 7 years of invisible devotion into a framework that made sense. The bond pulsed between them, and she felt the moment understanding shifted to something more complex, anger still, yes, but tangled with protectiveness and a fierce denial that made her chest ache. So you decided to destroy yourself instead, he said finally. Decided I was worth your life, your wolf. 7 years of suffering in silence. You're the Alpha King. You matter. I'm just my mate. He said it with finality, with the kind of authority that had brought alphas to their knees. You're my mate, Dorcas. You matter because you're mine, and I don't care what some prophecy said when you were 14 and traumatized. I don't care if fate itself says you're dangerous. You're mine, and I protect what's mine. The declaration should have warmed her, should have filled the hollow spaces 7 years of loneliness had carved. But all Dorcas felt was terror, because this claiming, this acceptance, was exactly what the prophecy had warned against. The moment he acknowledged the bond, the moment he chose her, the countdown began. You don't understand, she whispered. My death sense, my gift, it's never wrong. Every vision I've had, every warning, they all come true. The prophecy felt the same. Absolute. Inevitable. If we do this, if you claim me, you die. Then I die. Simple. Unbending. The kind of statement that allowed no argument. But I'll be damned if I let you face whatever's coming alone. No more hiding. No more poison. No more pretending you're not the most important person in this kingdom. Before she could respond, before she could explain that he was being impossibly stubborn and foolish and everything she'd both loved and feared about him, a new presence made itself known. Not an attack this time, something older, something that hummed with power that predated the palace, predated the Pax, predated memory itself. The air in the corridor shifted, pressure building like the moment before lightning struck. The torches flickered and dimmed, and Dorcas's death sense suddenly went quiet in a way that was more unsettling than any warning. It was the silence of standing in something so vast that individual deaths became meaningless. The silence of ancient things waking. Theron moved instinctively, putting himself between Dorcas and the source of the disturbance. But she stepped around him. 7 years of protecting him was a habit impossible to break, and faced the phenomenon with her heart hammering against her ribs. The stones of the North Tower were old, part of the original palace structure that had stood for centuries. Dorcas had walked past them 1,000 times without noticing anything unusual. But now they were glowing. Faint lines of silver light traced patterns in the rock, spreading like veins, like roots, like something alive waking from a very long sleep. What is this? Theron's voice was steady, but she could feel his wariness through the bond. I don't know. Dorcas moved closer, drawn by instinct she didn't understand. The light pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat, and somewhere deep in her chest, her poisoned wolf stirred with interest for the first time in years. The palace is built on sacred ground, Marcus told me once. The original pack settled here because of the old magic, but I thought it was just history. Legend. Legends don't usually glow. He was beside her now, had given up on staying between her and potential danger. They stood together as the silver lines coalesced into something recognizable, symbols, ancient and complex, written in a language that predated the common tongue. But Dorcas could read them. Shouldn't have been able to, had never studied the old script, yet the meaning poured into her mind like water finding level. The knowledge came with a bone-deep certainty that this was why her gift existed, why she'd survived when she should have died, why fate had tied her to an alpha king against all logic. It's a map, she breathed. No, not a map. A record. The original prophecy. The one about you being a blade? Theron's hand found hers, fingers threading through hers with a possessiveness that would have made her heart sing under different circumstances. No. She traced one of the glowing lines, and the symbols shifted, rearranged themselves, told a story that made her blood run cold. That wasn't the prophecy. That was a corruption. A lie someone planted in my dreams when I was vulnerable, when I was dying. The real prophecy. The symbols blazed brighter, and suddenly Dorcas was drowning in visions that weren't her death sense, weren't her gift, but something older. Something that had been waiting for her to be strong enough, aware enough, desperate enough to see. She saw the moon goddess herself, radiant and terrible, standing at the moment of creation. Saw her breathe life into the first wolves, saw her gift them with mates and bonds, and the ability to love so fiercely it transcended death. But she also saw the goddess's warning: power seeks balance. Light casts shadow. For every gift, there will be those who covet, who corrupt, who steal. The vision shifted. A blood witch, not Alara, someone older, the first of her kind, learning to siphon life force from the mate bonds themselves. Learning to twist prophecy, to plant false visions, to turn gifts into curses. And her descendants, carrying on the tradition, hunting for the most powerful bonds because those held the most potency. Then Dorcas saw herself. Saw the night Theron had found her, saw the mate bond snap into place. Not unusual, not particularly powerful, just a standard connection between an Omega and an Alpha. But then she saw what happened next. Saw the blood witch magic that had infected her village, that had orchestrated the rogue attack, that had beaten her nearly to death. Saw it trying to corrupt the bond, trying to plant false prophecy to keep her from ever claiming her mate. Because a bond unclaimed was a bond vulnerable. A bond suppressed was a bond that could be harvested. For 7 years, every time Dorcas had poisoned herself to hide from Theron, she'd been making herself the perfect victim. Every time she'd weakened her wolf, she'd been creating a reservoir of untapped mate bond energy that a skilled blood witch could eventually drain. And Alara, clever, patient Alara, had been positioning herself perfectly. Demanding Dorcas's exile right before the bonding ceremony, right when the siphoning would be easiest, when Dorcas would be isolated and heartbroken and too devastated to fight back. The false prophecy hadn't been protecting Theron. It had been ensuring Dorcas would be the perfect power source for whoever finally figured out how to harvest her. No, the word escaped as a sob. 7 years. 7 years of sacrifice and suffering and self-destruction, all based on a lie. All playing directly into the trap that had been set the night she'd first felt death coming for her village. The visions released her abruptly, and Dorcas would have collapsed if Theron hadn't been there to catch her. She clung to him, shaking, mind reeling from the weight of revelation. Everything she'd believed about herself, about her curse, about the danger she posed, all of it had been manipulation. Brilliant, long-term, multi-generational manipulation by blood witches who'd learned that the best way to harvest a mate bond was to make sure it was never properly claimed. Dorcas. Theron's voice was rough, and she realized he'd seen it too. The bond must have carried the visions to him, shown him everything. 7 years you've been torturing yourself over a lie. I thought I was protecting you. She couldn't stop shaking. I thought staying away, staying silent, was keeping you safe. You were keeping yourself isolated. His arms tightened around her, making yourself vulnerable to exactly the kind of predator now trying to bond with me. The fury in his voice wasn't directed at her. She could feel that through the connection, but at the situation, the manipulation, the sheer calculated cruelty of it. The real prophecy, Dorcas said, pulling back enough to look at him. Did you see it? The actual words? His expression was grim. The Omega who loves the Alpha King will be the blade that ends the reign of shadows. She who is marked by death will stand between the living and the consuming dark. Only in claiming what was denied can the blood debt be broken. Not a warning, a promise. Not a curse, but a calling. She wasn't the danger, she was the solution. Her death sense wasn't a curse, but a weapon, something that could identify blood witch magic before it fully manifested. Her bond with Theron wasn't going to kill him, it was going to make them strong enough to face the real threat. Alara. And whoever else was part of this conspiracy. The bonding ceremony, Dorcas said, pieces falling into horrible place. 3 days from now. You'll be vulnerable during the ritual, your defenses down, your wolf focused on the bond. That's when she was planning to strike. To siphon everything, your alpha power, our unclaimed mate bond, probably half the pack's life force if the ceremony was going to be public. It was going to be public. Theron's jaw was tight. A show of unity, I was told. Every Alpha and Luna from the allied packs in attendance. Hundreds of witnesses. Hundreds of potential victims. Dorcas's stomach turned. This wasn't just about her and Theron. This was a harvest on a scale that would devastate the entire region. And she'd almost let it happen. Almost exiled herself. Almost removed the one person whose gift could sense the wrongness before it was too late. We have to stop her, Dorcas said, though it felt impossibly inadequate. How did you stop someone who'd been planning this for years? Who had the trust of the Alpha King, the support of the Council, the perfect position to strike? We will. Theron's confidence was absolute, the kind of certainty that had won wars and unified packs. But first, you need to stop poisoning yourself. Your wolf needs to heal, the bond needs to stabilize. I need my mate at full strength, not half dead from 7 years of self-sacrifice. The word mate sent a thrill through her she had no right to feel given the circumstances. But the bond hummed with approval, with rightness, with the sense of pieces finally clicking into their proper configuration. The prophecy said only in claiming what was denied, she said softly. Claiming the bond. Properly. Completely. Yes. His hand came up to cup her face, thumb brushing away tears she hadn't realized were still falling. If you'll have me, if you can forgive me for being blind enough to miss you for 7 years, stupid enough to try to exile you, foolish enough to almost bond with a monster. The laugh that escaped was half-sob. There's nothing to forgive. You didn't know. I made sure you didn't know. Then we're both idiots, he said, and something in his expression softened. But we're alive. We know the truth. And we have 3 days to turn a trap into an execution. 3 days. It should have felt impossible. But as Dorcas stood in the corridor with ancient prophecy glowing on the walls and her mate's arms around her and the bond between them finally acknowledged, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 7 years. Hope. Dangerous, fragile, probably foolish hope. But hope nonetheless. Because she wasn't alone anymore. Wasn't hiding. Wasn't the cursed Omega girl everyone had feared and nobody had wanted. She was Dorcas Ashwood. Mate to the Alpha King. Bearer of a gift that could sense death itself. And the blade that would end the reign of shadows. The question was whether 3 days would be enough to figure out how. The palace woke to chaos. By dawn, news of the attack had spread through the halls like wildfire, distorted and exaggerated with each retelling. Shadow beasts in the North Tower. An assassination attempt on the Alpha King. Blood magic in the heart of the kingdom. The rumors spiraled, and with them, fear took root in places that had felt safe for decades. Dorcas stood in Theron's private study, exhausted and wired in equal measure, watching the sun paint gold across the valley below. She hadn't slept. Hadn't dared to, not with her death sense humming with low-level warnings that meant danger still circulated, still planned, still waited for the perfect moment to strike. Beside her, Theron was a solid presence, radiating the kind of barely contained fury that made even his own guards nervous. The council had been summoned. Emergency session, called before most of the palace had finished breakfast. And Dorcas, for the first time in 7 years, was attending. Not as the invisible apprentice who sometimes delivered medicine to ailing council members, but as the Alpha King's acknowledged mate. The shock of that still hadn't fully settled. Every time the bond pulsed with Theron's presence, every time she caught his scent and her wolf stirred with interest instead of suppressed longing, it felt surreal. 7 years of hiding ended in a single night. 7 years of poison, stopped with one conversation and a command from her mate that she would heal, would let her wolf recover, would not continue destroying herself. She'd taken the counteragent an hour ago. The antidote to 7 years of systematic suppression, a formula Marcus had helped her synthesize once she'd explained, haltingly, ashamed, what she'd been doing to herself. The old physician had looked at her with such profound sadness that Dorcas had nearly broken down again. But there'd been no time for tears, no space for processing trauma when a blood witch was circling and hundreds of lives hung in the balance. The antidote burned. Even now, she could feel it working through her system, purging the accumulated toxins, trying to revive a wolf that had been systematically starved for years. It would take time, Marcus had warned her of that. Days, maybe weeks before her wolf fully recovered. Before the bond stabilized into what it should have been. Time they didn't have. The study door opened without preamble, and Cashin strode in, Theron's head of security, a massive alpha with scars that told stories and eyes that missed nothing. He took one look at Dorcas standing beside the king, at the way Theron's hand rested possessively on her lower back, and his expression cycled through surprise, understanding, and grim satisfaction. "Well," Cashin said, voice rough as gravel, "that explains a few things." "Does it?" Theron's tone was neutral, but Dorcas could feel the tension thrumming through him via the bond. "Why you never took a chosen mate, despite every alpha in the region parading their daughters through here." Cashin's gaze shifted to Dorcas, assessing. Not hostile, but measuring. "Why you kept the physician's apprentice close, gave her access most Omegas would never get. Why you looked ready to murder someone when you announced the bonding ceremony with Alara." Theron's hand tightened fractionally against Dorcas's back. "I didn't know," he admitted, and there was frustration in the words. "She hid it from me. Successfully. For 7 years. Not successfully enough." Cashin moved to the window, scanning the grounds below with professional paranoia. "Your wolf knew. Maybe you didn't understand what you were feeling, but you protected her. Kept her close. Some instinct wouldn't let you send her away despite having no logical reason to keep an Omega apprentice in the inner palace." The revelation settled uncomfortably in Dorcas's chest. She'd thought herself invisible, thought her suppression of the bond had been complete. But maybe some part of Theron had always known, had always felt the pull despite her best efforts to hide it. The thought was both comforting and devastating. 7 years they could have had, 7 years of partnership instead of loneliness, stolen by a lie planted by Bloodwitch magic. "The council is gathering," Cashin continued. "And Alara is already there, playing the concerned bride-to-be. She's done a remarkable job of looking shocked and frightened by the attack. Several council members are advocating for increased security around her, convinced the assassination attempt means someone is targeting the upcoming bonding." "Let me guess," Theron said, voice dry as bone. "She's suggesting the threat might be internal. Someone who opposes the alliance." She mentioned concerns about pack members who feel overlooked for the Luna position. Cashin's expression was carefully blank, but Dorcas caught the implication. Alara was already spinning the narrative, already positioning herself as the victim and casting suspicion on anyone who might oppose her. Casting suspicion on Dorcas, specifically. The timing of her exile demand, followed immediately by an attack, it painted a picture of jealous Omega, of someone unstable enough to hire blood magic assassins rather than accept defeat gracefully. "She's framing me," Dorcas said, and was proud that her voice remained steady. "Making it look like I orchestrated the attack because I couldn't handle being sent away." "Yes." Cashin looked at her with something that might have been respect. "You understand political maneuvering. I understand survival. 7 years of watching from the shadows, of navigating palace dynamics without ever being seen as a player." She learned more about politics than most people realized, simply by being invisible and paying attention. "The council doesn't know about the bond," Theron said. It wasn't a question, but Cashin shook his head anyway. "Not yet, though they're about to. You can't walk in there with her and expect no one to notice." He gestured between them. "The way you're standing, the possessiveness, every wolf in that room will feel it the moment you enter." "Good." Theron's voice was hard. "Let them feel it. Let them understand exactly what Alara tried to destroy last night." Dorcas's heart lurched. "Theron, if we reveal the bond now, she'll accelerate her timeline. She'll know we're aware, know we're preparing. We'll lose any advantage surprise might give us. We'll also show strength." He turned to face her fully, both hands coming up to frame her face with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the steel in his voice. "The bond is our weapon, Dorcas. It's what she wanted to harvest, what she's spent years positioning herself to steal. If we claim it openly, completely, we remove her primary power source." "And paint a target on our backs," Dorcas countered, even as she leaned into his touch. "A fully bonded pair is harder to siphon from, yes, but we're not fully bonded yet. We're vulnerable and she knows it. Knows I've been suppressing for years, knows my wolf is damaged, knows the bond won't stabilize immediately. The three of them stood in tense silence, weighing strategies, calculating risks. Outside, the palace continued its nervous mourning, unaware that the true battle hadn't even begun yet. It was Cashin who spoke next, voice low and thoughtful. There's a third option. Let the council see the bond, you won't be able to hide it anyway. But don't explain it. Let Alara scramble, let her wonder how much you know, how much you've figured out. Feed her uncertainty instead of confirmation. Political theater, Theron said, but there was consideration in his tone. War is 90% theater and 10% violence, Cashin replied. You taught me that. Make her think you're focused on the bond, on claiming your mate, on personal matters. Let her believe she still has the advantage, that the attack failed, but her larger plan remains undetected. While we investigate. Dorcas could see the shape of it now, the strategy taking form. While we figure out who else is involved, how deep this conspiracy runs, what exactly she's planning for the ceremony. 2 days and 3 nights, Theron said grimly. That's what we have to dismantle whatever she's built and find a way to stop it. 2 days to save hundreds of lives, Dorcas added, thinking of all the alphas and Lunas who'd be attending, all the pack members who'd gather to witness what they thought would be a celebration. All the potential victims. A knock at the door interrupted them. Marcus entered, the old physician's expression grave. He carried a tray with vials and dried herbs, more antidote, more supplements to help Dorcas's wolf heal. But his eyes held a warning that made her death sense pulse with attention. The council is ready, Marcus said quietly. And there's been a development. 3 pack members were found dead in their quarters this morning. No visible wounds, no signs of struggle. Just empty. Like something drained them completely. The horror of it settled in Dorcas's stomach like ice. Blood magic. She's feeding. Building power for whatever she has planned. Or sending a message, Cashin said darkly. That she can kill with impunity, that no one is safe. Who are they? Theron's voice was dangerously calm, the kind of quiet that preceded violence. Marcus consulted a small paper. 2 guards from the night watch. And an Omega healer who worked in the southern wing. He paused, meeting Dorcas's eyes with significance. The healer was one of the few people who knew about your condition. Who'd helped you source some of the herbs you required. The implication was clear. Alara was eliminating anyone who might connect Dorcas's suppressants to a larger pattern. Anyone who might provide testimony that complicated the narrative of jealous, unstable Omega. She's cleaning up loose ends, Dorcas said, and her voice shook with fury. Killing people who were kind to me, who helped me, just to maintain her cover. Theron's hand found hers, squeezed tight. Through the bond, she felt his rage cold and controlled and absolutely lethal. This wasn't just political anymore. Alara had murdered his people, had tried to kill his mate, had spent years manipulating him toward her own ends. And when Theron finally moved against her, there would be no mercy. But first, they had to survive the council meeting. Had to play the game Alara had started without revealing how many pieces they'd moved on the board. We go now, Theron decided. Together. Let them see the bond. Let Alara wonder what it means for her plans. And let's find out who on the council is already in her pocket. Because there had to be collaborators. No one could orchestrate something this elaborate alone, not without inside support, not without wolves who'd sold their loyalty for promises of power or position. The walk to the council chamber felt both too short and endless. Dorcas was acutely aware of every eye that followed them, every whispered conversation that stopped as they passed, every wolf who scented the air and went still with recognition. The bond was obvious now, blazing between them like a beacon. No more hiding. No more pretending to be invisible. It was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. The council chamber doors stood open, and the voices inside cut off abruptly as Theron entered with Dorcas at his side, his hand at her back in a gesture of unmistakable claiming. 12 council members sat around the ancient oak table, and every one of them turned to stare. Dorcas felt their shock, their confusion, their rapid recalculation of palace dynamics. And at the far end of the table, serene and beautiful in a gown of ice blue, Alara smiled. It was a perfect smile. Warm and welcoming and entirely devoid of genuine emotion. Her eyes, pale green like winter frost, tracked over Dorcas with an assessment that felt like being dissected. Looking for weaknesses. For vulnerabilities. For confirmation that her plans remained intact despite the previous night's failure. Alpha King, Alara said, voice pitched to carry concern and confusion in equal measure. I wasn't aware you'd be bringing a guest to the emergency session. Given the sensitive nature of last night's attack, the implication was clear. An Omega apprentice had no place in council business, especially not during a crisis. The council members shifted, uncertain. Protocol said Alara was right, but the bond said something entirely different. Theron's expression revealed nothing as he moved his seat at the table's head, bringing Dorcas with him. I'm bringing my mate, he said simply, and his voice carried the absolute authority that had unified 3 fractious packs. Who has every right to be present when threats to my life are discussed? The chamber erupted into chaos. The council chamber had finally cleared 3 hours past midday, leaving behind the acrid scent of anger and suspicion and wolves who'd been forced to recalculate everything they thought they knew about their king. The session had been brutal, accusations flying, council members taking sides, Alara playing her role of shocked and wounded bride-to-be with theatrical precision. She'd even managed tears when Theron had formally dissolved their betrothal agreement, citing the mate bond as sacred law that superseded political arrangement. No one could argue with a true mate bond. Not without challenging the moon goddess herself. But the looks Alara had given Dorcas when she thought no one was watching, those had been filled with such concentrated venom that Dorcas's death sense had screamed warnings for the entire 3 hours. Death was circling closer. The body count would rise. And Alara's timeline had definitely accelerated. The careful, patient mask had cracked just enough to show the monster underneath. Now Dorcas stood in Theron's private chambers, not the formal receiving rooms, but his actual living space that almost no one was permitted to enter. The intimacy of it made her hyper-aware of every detail. The massive bed draped in furs, the weapons mounted on the walls, the scent of him saturating the air until her damaged wolf whimpered with recognition and longing. This was where he slept, where he dropped the crown's weight, where the king became just a man. And she was here. After 7 years of staying invisible, staying distant, staying safe in her tiny apprentice quarters, she was in the Alpha King's personal domain because she was his mate, and there was no safer place in the entire kingdom. Theron moved through the space with economical grace, securing the door with a heavy bolt, checking the windows with professional paranoia, setting wards that hummed with his alpha power, making absolutely certain they wouldn't be interrupted or overheard. When he finally turned to face her, some of the rigid control he'd maintained through the council meeting had fractured, leaving something rawer visible in his expression. You need to eat, he said, gesturing to the table where someone, probably Cashin, had left a tray of food. And rest. You look like you're about to collapse. Dorcas probably was about to collapse. The antidote was still working through her system, fighting 7 years of accumulated poison, and the effort was taking a physical toll. Her hands trembled slightly when she reached for the water glass, and sitting down felt like the best thing that had happened to her all day. Theron watched her with an intensity that made her skin heat. Not threatening, but absolutely focused. He'd removed his formal council jacket, standing now in just a shirt and trousers that emphasized the warrior's build beneath the royal trappings. Even exhausted and running on fumes, Dorcas felt the pull of attraction, something she'd suppressed along with the bond for 7 years, something that now blazed to life with uncomfortable intensity. I should go, she said, even as everything in her protested the idea. You need to prepare, need to strategize with Cashin about security, You need to stay. He crossed to her in 3 strides, kneeling so they were eye level. The position put him in a place of supplication despite being the most powerful wolf in the region, and something about that vulnerability made her throat tight. Please. I've missed 7 years of knowing you. Don't ask me to spend tonight apart when I just found out you existed. The honesty in his voice, in his expression, in the bond that pulsed between them, it was almost too much. Dorcas had spent so long protecting herself from hope, from wanting, from believing she deserved anything beyond the shadows. Having it offered freely felt like touching fire. You don't know me, she whispered, echoing his words from the garden. Not really. You know I'm your mate, you know about the bond, but the actual person I am. So tell me. His hands covered hers where they rested in her lap. We have tonight. No council, no Alara, no politics. Just us. Tell me who Dorcas Ashwood is when she's not busy saving my life from threats I don't even see. And maybe it was exhaustion, or the antidote lowering her defenses, or 7 years of loneliness finally cracking open. But Dorcas found herself talking. Haltingly at first, then with increasing ease as Theron listened with absolute attention. She told him about her childhood before the death sense manifested, about her grandmother who'd taught her to see beauty in the smallest herbs, about the first time she'd realized she was different and the slow, awful progression from different to feared to hated. She told him about the night of the rogue attack, about the power that had exploded out of her and destroyed the very people she'd tried to save. About crawling into the forest to die because living as the cursed thing felt more unbearable than simply stopping. And then you found me, she said softly. And for the first time since my grandmother died, someone looked at me like I was worth saving. You didn't know anything about me, didn't know if I was dangerous or damaged or cursed, but you picked me up anyway. Brought me here. Made me a promise. A promise I broke. The guilt in his voice was palpable. A promise you thought you had to break. She turned her hands over, threading her fingers through his. Alara played you, Theron. Played all of us. She knew exactly what buttons to push, exactly how to position me as a threat to her bonding, exactly how to get me out of the way before the ceremony. She almost succeeded. His grip tightened. If those constructs had been better made, if your counteragent hadn't worked, if the bond hadn't revealed itself when it did. But it did. Dorcas leaned forward, resting her forehead against his. The gesture was instinctive, intimate, something the bond craved. We're here. We're alive. We have a chance to stop her. For a long moment they stayed like that, breathing the same air, the bond humming between them with increasing strength as her body continued purging the suppressants. Dorcas could feel Theron's wolf now, not just his human emotions, but the primal creature underneath. It was pacing, possessive, frustrated that its mate was damaged and that it couldn't simply fix her with will alone. Tell me about the death sense, Theron said eventually, pulling back just enough to meet her eyes. How it works. What it feels like. No one had ever asked her that. Not in curiosity, anyway. People had demanded demonstrations or accused her of lying or begged her to make it stop, but no one had simply wanted to understand. It's like standing in a river, Dorcas said slowly, reaching for words to explain something she'd never tried to articulate. Life force flows around me constantly. Every person, every animal, every living thing has a current. Most of the time it's background noise, just the awareness that I'm surrounded by vitality. But when death is coming, when that thread is about to be cut, the current changes. Goes wrong. It's like hearing music and suddenly one instrument is out of tune, except the discord is in my chest, my bones, my entire being. And you feel this all the time? All the time, she confirmed. Some days it's subtle. Other days it's overwhelming. The night you found me, I'd felt death coming for weeks. The rogue attack. My own death, I thought, though I realize now it was probably the other villagers. By the time you carried me into the palace, I was so saturated with death warnings that I couldn't distinguish individual threads anymore. It was just noise. Screaming. His thumb stroked over her knuckles, a gesture of comfort. And the prophecy visions? The false one Alara's magic planted, could you tell the difference? No. The admission hurt. It felt the same as my gift. That same bone-deep certainty. I've spent 7 years hating myself for being the weapon that would end you, and it was a lie the entire time. A manipulation so perfect I never questioned it. Question it now, Theron said, voice fierce. Question everything you've believed about being cursed. Because from where I'm standing, your gift has saved my life more times than I can count. Has positioned you perfectly to sense Alara's blood magic when no one else could. Has brought you to exactly this moment when we need you most. Or it's brought us to the moment when everything falls apart. Dorcas couldn't help the pessimism. 7 years of expecting the worst didn't fade in a single night. Then we fall apart together. He rose, pulling her up with him, and suddenly they were standing too close, the space between them charged with more than just the bond. I need you to understand something, Dorcas. I'm not going to let you face this alone. I'm not going to let you sacrifice yourself to save me. Whatever happens with Alara, whatever she's planning, we handle it as a bonded pair. Equal partners. I'm not your equal. The protest was automatic. You're the Alpha King. I'm just my mate. He said it with finality. Which makes you my queen, my Luna, my equal in every way that matters. The council will formalize it tomorrow, but the bond already knows. My wolf already knows. And you need to know it too. Queen. Luna. The titles felt impossible, like trying on clothing meant for someone else. Dorcas had spent 7 years being invisible, being the quiet apprentice, being nothing and no one. The idea of standing beside Theron as his acknowledged partner, of having authority and power and visibility, it was terrifying. It was also, she realized with dawning wonder, what she'd wanted all along. Not the titles or the power, but the partnership. The right to stand beside him instead of in the shadows. The acknowledgement that she mattered, that her presence had value beyond the emergencies she'd prevented in secret. I don't know how to be a queen, she said honestly. I didn't know how to be a king when I inherited the crown at 23. Theron's hand came up to cup her face, thumb tracing her cheekbone. We'll figure it out together. But first, we need you healthy. We need the bond stable. We need your wolf healed enough to fight. 2 days, Dorcas said. Marcus said it could take weeks for full recovery. Then we work with what we have. He guided her toward the bed, and her heart stuttered at the implication before he added, You're going to sleep. Actually sleep, for the first time in probably months without poison in your system. And I'm going to stay right here and make sure nothing disturbs you. The bed was impossibly soft when she sank down onto it, her body suddenly acknowledging just how exhausted it truly was. The antidote, the council meeting, the emotional whiplash of the past 12 hours, it all crashed over her at once. But even as her eyes drifted closed, even as sleep pulled at her with insistent hands, Dorcas fought against it. The warning, she murmured. Death is still coming. I can feel it getting closer. I know. Theron settled beside her, not lying down but sitting against the headboard, one hand stroking through her hair with surprising gentleness. Your death sense has been pulsing through the bond for hours. But whatever's coming, we'll face it when you're rested. Sleep, Dorcas. Let me keep watch for once. The role reversal should have felt wrong. She was the guardian, the protector, the one who stayed vigilant. But the bond hummed with rightness, with the understanding that partnership meant taking turns, meant trusting someone else to hold the line while you recovered. So Dorcas let her eyes close. Let exhaustion claim her. Let herself, for the first time in 7 years, believe that maybe she didn't have to carry everything alone. She dreamed, but not of prophecy or death or blood magic. She dreamed of a garden full of moonblooms and wolfsbane, of Theron standing in the center with his hand extended, of stepping forward to take it without fear or hesitation, of finally being seen. When she woke hours later in full darkness, it was to the sound of Theron's low voice and Cashin's urgent response. The death sense was screaming now, no longer a distant warning, but an immediate threat. Someone in the palace was dying. Multiple someones. and the countdown to Alara's endgame had just accelerated into crisis. The bodies were found in the eastern wing, arranged in a pattern that made Dorcas's stomach turn. 5 wolves. All Omega healers from the physician's staff. All drained completely, their life force siphoned until nothing remained but empty husks wearing familiar faces. And at the center of the arrangement, drawn in what looked like blood but smelled like corrupted magic, was a symbol Dorcas recognized from the ancient prophecy in the North Tower. The mark of the consuming dark. She stood in the corridor outside the death room, Theron's arm around her shoulders the only thing keeping her upright. These had been her colleagues. Wolves she'd worked beside for 7 years, who'd taught her compound preparations and surgical techniques and which herbs grew best in shade. Linera, who'd always saved the honey cakes from breakfast for Dorcas because she knew they were her favorite. Sorrel, who'd covered for her the mornings she'd been too weak from the poison to rise on time. Faye, who'd gossiped about the handsome guards and tried to convince Dorcas to attend the seasonal festivals. Dead. All of them dead, murdered to fuel blood magic and send a message that was becoming horrifyingly clear. Alara wasn't just accelerating her timeline. She was making a statement, demonstrating her power, showing that she could kill with impunity, could take lives in the heart of the palace, could arrange bodies like art and dare anyone to stop her. "This is my fault," Dorcas heard herself say, voice hollow. "She's killing them because of me. Because they helped me, knew me, might have testified about the suppressants." "This is Alara's fault," Theron countered, his fury a living thing that vibrated through the bond. "She's choosing this. She's the one draining innocent wolves to power her twisted magic." Cashin emerged from the death room, his scarred face set in grim lines. "The pattern is a siphoning array," he said without preamble. "Old magic, the kind that's been forbidden for centuries. She's not just killing them, she's storing their life force. Building a reservoir. For the bonding ceremony," Dorcas said, pieces clicking into horrible clarity. She was going to use the ceremony to access hundreds of wolves, but now that's cancelled. So she's gathering power another way, building up enough stolen life force to attempt something even without the public ritual. Attempt what? Theron's voice was dangerously calm. Dorcas closed her eyes, reaching for her death sense, trying to read the pattern beyond the immediate tragedy. The symbol on the floor pulsed with wrongness, and through it she could feel threads extending throughout the palace. Not life exactly, but the potential for life to be taken. Alara had been setting this up for months, maybe years. Positioning herself perfectly, weaving a web of blood magic so subtle that no one had noticed until it was nearly complete. "A coup," Dorcas breathed, understanding flooding through her. She's planning a coup. Not just harvesting the mate bond or siphoning pack members. She wants to take everything. Your alpha power, the pack bonds that tie every wolf to you, the territory magic itself. She wants to consume you completely and step into the vacuum as the new ruler. The silence that followed was absolute. Even Cashin, who'd seen decades of warfare and political machination, looked shaken. This wasn't simple assassination. This was something far more ambitious and infinitely more dangerous. "She can't," Theron said, but there was doubt in his voice. "The pack bonds are sacred. They can't be stolen." "They can if you're dead and she's positioned as your bonded mate," Cashin said quietly. "Or close enough to bonded that pack law recognizes her claim. If she'd succeeded in the public ceremony, if you'd been vulnerable during the ritual, she could have drained you and immediately claimed the grieving widow role. The pack would have accepted her leadership out of respect for your memory, and by the time anyone realized something was wrong, she'd have consolidated enough power to be unstoppable. But the ceremony is cancelled," Dorcas said. "So how does she stopped, death sense suddenly screaming a warning so urgent she gasped with the force of it. "The council. She's targeting the council. Tonight." She knew it with absolute certainty, could feel the death approaching like a wave about to crest. The council members who'd attended the emergency session, who'd witnessed Theron claim Dorcas as his mate, who'd seen Alara's carefully constructed plans crumble, They were the targets. Kill them, frame it as retaliation from whoever sent the shadow constructs, throw the kingdom into enough chaos that emergency measures would be required. Emergency measures that would give Alara, as the former bride-to-be and trusted political ally, exactly the opening she needed. We need to warn them, Dorcas said urgently. Now, before. The explosion cut off her words. Somewhere in the western wing, the concussive force of magic detonating rattled the palace to its foundations. Screams followed, and the scent of blood and burning filled the air. Theron was moving before the echoes faded, Cashin right behind him, both of them running toward the disaster with weapons drawn. Dorcas followed, her healer's instincts overriding common sense. There would be wounded. There would be dying wolves who needed someone with her skills and her death sense to have any chance of survival. Her legs protested, still weak from years of poison and the antidote's purging, but she pushed through pain and exhaustion because that's what she'd always done. The Western Wing Council quarters were destroyed. What had been elegant apartments for visiting dignitaries and high-ranking advisors was now rubble and flame. Wolves screamed in the wreckage, trapped or injured or dying. And standing in the center of the destruction, serene and untouched, was Alara. She dropped the mask entirely. No more concerned bride, no more political ally, no more carefully maintained facade of warmth. The wolf standing in the ruins wore power like a cloak, and her pale green eyes glowed with stolen life force. The 5 Omega healers, the 3 wolves from this morning, the goddess only knew how many others, their deaths fueled the creature before them. Alpha King, Alara said, and her voice echoed with unnatural resonance. How kind of you to join us. I was hoping we'd have this conversation before the end. Theron stood at the edge of the destruction, radiating lethal intent. Release my people. Surrender yourself to pack justice. It's the only mercy you'll receive. Alara laughed, and the sound was sharp as breaking glass. Mercy? From the king who cast me aside for a broken Omega? From the wolf too blind to see what was right in front of him for years? Her gaze shifted to Dorcas, and the hatred there was pure and concentrated. She should have been easy. A traumatized child with convenient gifts and a suppressible mate bond. I've been siphoning from her for 7 years. Every time she poisoned herself, every time she weakened her wolf, she made it easier for me to feed. I should have drained her completely months ago. The revelation hit like a physical blow. 7 years of self-sacrifice, and Alara had been feeding from it the entire time, using Dorcas's own attempt to protect Theron as a power source. The false prophecy hadn't just kept her isolated, it had turned her into a battery for blood magic. But you got greedy, Dorcas said, understanding clicking into place. Couldn't resist trying for the full harvest during a public bonding ceremony. If you'd just killed me quietly and taken what I had, you might have succeeded. Oh, I will succeed, Alara said pleasantly. This is just an adjustment to the timeline. Less elegant than I'd planned, but effective nonetheless. By dawn, half the council will be dead or incapacitated. The kingdom will be in chaos. And you, my dear Alpha King, will be faced with an impossible choice. She gestured, and from the shadows behind her, figures emerged. Not blood magic constructs this time, but actual wolves. Pack members, their eyes glazed with compulsion magic, moving with the jerky precision of puppets. Dorcas recognized several of them, guards, servants, wolves who'd been loyal to Theron for years. I've been building my collection, Alara continued conversationally. Every wolf I've touched, every casual conversation, every formal greeting, I've been planting seeds of control. Right now, I have 63 wolves under my direct command. And if you move against me, if you try to stop this, I'll kill them all. Drain every single one before you can cross the distance between us. It was checkmate. Or it would have been if Alara had been facing a normal Alpha King. But Theron had been waging political and physical warfare since he was barely old enough to shift. His expression revealed nothing, but through the bond, Dorcas felt his mind working at lethal speed, calculating angles and possibilities. You're bluffing, Theron said calmly. Those wolves are your power base. Your leverage. Kill them, and you have nothing. I have enough stored life force to level this palace, Alara countered. The wolves are just a bonus. Insurance to make sure you don't try anything heroic. Her smile was knife-sharp. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to step down. Publicly, voluntarily, citing the chaos and your inability to protect your people. You're going to name me as interim ruler while a new alpha is chosen. And then you're going to walk away and live out your days as a broken king who couldn't save his kingdom. And if I refuse? Then everyone dies. Simple. Final. Absolutely sincere. Starting with your precious mate. Ilara's hand came up, and Dorcas felt power gathering, the same corrupted magic that had animated the shadow constructs, but amplified 100-fold. This was what 8 deaths had bought, what 7 years of careful siphoning had built toward. Enough stolen life force to kill with a gesture, to destroy without effort. The death sense didn't scream. It howled. Every instinct Dorcas possessed said she had seconds at most before that power released and ended her. But she'd spent 7 years saving Theron from deaths he never saw coming. 7 years orchestrating rescues from the shadows. 7 years becoming the palace's invisible guardian. And even now, even facing her own imminent death, she couldn't stop calculating how to protect him. The answer came with crystal clarity. Ilara needed her dead to complete the siphoning, to claim the mate bond's full power. But she needed Theron alive, at least temporarily, to force his abdication. Which meant the attack would be focused entirely on Dorcas. Which meant Theron would have an opening. Their eyes met across the destroyed council quarters, and through the bond, Dorcas sent everything she couldn't say aloud. I love you. I've loved you for 7 years. Trust me. One more time, trust me. Then she stepped forward, directly into Ilara's line of fire, and let the blood magic come. The pain was instantaneous and absolute. It felt like being unmade from the inside out, every cell screaming as corrupted magic tried to rip her life force away. Dorcas's vision went white, her knees buckled, and distantly she heard Theron roar with fury and grief. But she'd been poisoning herself for 7 years. Had built up resistances to things that would kill a normal wolf. Had learned to survive when her body wanted to quit. And her death sense, that gift she'd hated for so long, suddenly inverted. Instead of sensing death, she felt life. Her own life force, yes, but also the stolen energy Ilara was trying to claim. The Omega Healers. The guards. Every victim the Blood Witch had drained. Their essence was still there, trapped in the magic that had killed them, waiting for someone who could sense the threads between life and death to set them free. Dorcas reached for those threads with everything she had. Reached for the power Ilara had stolen, the lives cut short, the magic corrupted from its original purpose. And she pulled. The effect was cataclysmic. Ilara's spell shattered as the stolen life force suddenly reversed direction, flooding back toward its source, not to resurrect the dead, that was beyond even ancient magic, but to break the bonds holding it captive. The explosion of released energy sent Ilara flying backward, her concentration broken, her control over the compelled wolves snapping like cut strings. Theron moved. One moment he was at the destruction's edge. The next he was on Ilara, alpha power, and 7 years of barely contained fury finally unleashed. They collided with brutal force, and the entire palace shook with the impact of 2 massive wills clashing. Dorcas collapsed to the floor, gasping, her body shaking from the effort of channeling that much magic. She'd freed the stolen life force, but the cost, she could feel her wolf whimpering, feel the fragile healing from the antidote completely undone. She'd bought Theron his opening, but she might have destroyed herself in the process. Through failing vision, she watched the Alpha King and the Blood Witch tear each other apart. Watched Cashin rally the freed wolves, organizing them to contain the fight, to evacuate the wounded. Watched the kingdom she'd protected from shadows finally see the threat she'd been sensing for weeks. And she watched Ilara, backed into a corner and losing, make one final desperate gamble. The Blood Witch's hand plunged into her own chest, ripping out something that glowed with sickly light. A heart, Dorcas realized with horror. Not her physical heart, but the core of her stolen power, condensed into physical form. Every life she'd taken, every drop of force she'd siphoned, crystallized into a weapon of last resort. If I can't have this kingdom, Alara snarled, no one will. She crushed the heart, and the magic detonated. The last thing Dorcas saw before darkness claimed her was Theron's face, twisted with anguish, reaching for her as the world exploded into fire and pain and the screaming certainty that this time, death had finally come for them both. Death had a peculiar texture. Dorcas floated in it, suspended between heartbeats, between existence and oblivion. This was different from the death sense warnings she'd carried for years. This was the actual experience of dying, of feeling her life force unravel thread by thread. The explosion had torn through her already damaged body, and somewhere in the distance she could hear Theron screaming her name, could feel his anguish through a mate bond that was fraying at the edges. She should let go, should slip into the dark and finally rest after 7 years of fighting, of sacrificing, of carrying impossible burdens. It would be easy, peaceful even. The pain would stop. The fear would end. She could finally lay down the weight of being the cursed Omega girl who'd never been enough. Except she could still feel them. The stolen lives Alara had trapped in her corrupted magic. The 5 Omega healers, the guards, every victim over the years, their essence hadn't dissipated with the explosion. It was still here, still suspended in the space between life and death where Dorcas now existed. And they were calling to her, not with voices, but with a resonance her gift recognized. For a yes. Finish it. Don't let her win. Dorcas tried to respond, tried to explain that she was dying too, that she had nothing left to give. But the death sense that had defined her entire existence suddenly shifted. Inverted. Became something she'd never imagined possible. If she could sense death, if she could feel the exact moment life force severed from flesh, then couldn't she also sense the opposite? Couldn't she feel the moments where life insisted on continuing despite impossible odds? Where survival became an act of defiance rather than simple biology? The knowledge bloomed in her consciousness, like moonflowers opening to darkness. Her gift had never been about death at all. It had been about the threshold, the liminal space where life and death met and negotiated. She'd been so focused on sensing the endings that she'd missed the other half of her power entirely. The half that could pull someone back from the edge. Dorcas reached for her own unraveling life force, with hands that weren't physical, with will that transcended flesh. Reached for the threads Alara's explosion had severed and began, painstakingly, impossibly, to weave them back together. It hurt worse than anything she'd experienced, worse than the beating in the woods, worse than 7 years of poison, worse than dying. This was choosing life when death would be merciful, was fighting when surrender beckoned. But she'd been fighting her entire existence. What was one more impossible battle? The stolen lives helped. They couldn't give her their energy. They were already gone, already past the threshold. But they could show her how. Could guide her understanding of the gift she'd been using wrong for 21 years. Death sense wasn't a curse. It was the rarest of abilities, the one that let a wolf stand in the space between and make choices that defied fate itself. Dorcas felt her heart stutter, then catch. Felt her lungs drag in air that tasted like ash and blood and magic. Felt her wolf, that poisoned, damaged, nearly destroyed part of herself, suddenly surge with strength that had no earthly source. The stolen lives were lending her their final gift, the knowledge of what it meant to fight for every second, to refuse surrender, to become something more than the sum of your wounds. She opened her eyes to chaos. The western wing was an inferno. Alara's final detonation had set everything ablaze, and wolves scrambled to evacuate and contain the destruction. Through the flames, Dorcas could see Theron locked in combat with what remained of the Blood Witch. Alara had survived her own explosion, though barely. Her beautiful features were twisted with madness and desperation, her power flickering like a dying star. She'd gambled everything on that final attack, had poured her stolen reserves into trying to kill Dorcas and Theron simultaneously. She'd failed. But the cost of that failure was becoming catastrophically clear. The palace foundations groaned, ancient stone cracking under magical strain. The explosion had destabilized more than just the western wing. It had damaged the wards that protected the entire structure, had compromised the territorial magic that kept the kingdom stable. If the palace fell, if the nexus of pack power collapsed, it would take hours to contain the damage. Days to rebuild. People would die in the chaos. The kingdom Theron had spent years unifying would fracture. Alara knew it. Even beaten, even dying, she was still winning. Her laughter echoed through the burning corridors, sharp and broken. "You can't save them all," she called to Theron, dodging another strike. "The palace or your people. The kingdom or your mate. Choose, Alpha King. Choose and live with it." Because Dorcas was still down, still struggling to breathe, still too damaged to move. And the wolves trapped in the collapsing eastern wing were screaming for rescue. And the fire was spreading toward the archives where centuries of pack history would burn. And the wards were failing, leaving them vulnerable to anyone who wanted to strike while they were weak. Too many threats. Too many emergencies. No way to address them all. Unless Dorcas pushed herself to her knees, every muscle screaming protest. The death sense was still active, still howling warnings about imminent casualties. But underneath that, the new awareness pulsed the life sense, the ability to feel where survival was possible, where intervention could tip the scales. She could feel the wolves in the eastern wing, could sense their life forces flickering but not yet extinguished, could trace the paths that would lead them to safety if someone guided them, if someone could see through smoke and chaos to the routes that remained passable. She could feel the palace foundations, could sense where the territorial magic was anchored, where the old wards had been woven into stone by wolves long dead. Could see the fracture points and, more importantly, the places where the magic was still strong enough to hold if reinforced. She could feel Theron's pack bonds, the thousands of threads connecting him to every wolf in the kingdom. Could sense Alara's corruption trying to sever those threads, trying to create enough chaos that the entire network would collapse and leave the territory ripe for claiming. Too much. One wolf couldn't possibly address it all. One damaged Omega who could barely stand couldn't hope to. "You're not one wolf," the stolen lives whispered in her consciousness. "You're the threshold. The bridge. The one who stands between and refuses to choose." And suddenly Dorcas understood what her gift had been preparing her for her entire life. Not to prevent individual deaths, that had never been the point, but to stand in moments of catastrophic crisis and hold the line. To be the anchor when everything else was falling apart. To choose life over and over in the face of impossible odds. She reached for her wolf, not the poisoned creature she'd been killing for 7 years, but the primal essence beneath. The part of her that had manifested in desperate power when she was 14, that had survived beatings and exile and slow suicide because surrender simply wasn't in her nature. That wolf had been waiting, patient and fierce, for Dorcas to finally stop running from what she was. The shift took her by surprise. She'd barely been able to manage partial transformations while poisoned, had assumed her wolf was too damaged for full manifestation. But the antidote had done more than purge suppressants. It had begun healing damage she'd thought permanent. And the stolen lives, in their final gift, had shown her how to reach past the injuries to the core of what she'd always been. Dorcas's wolf was nothing like what an Omega should be. She was massive, for one thing, nearly alpha-sized, with fur that shimmered like starlight on water. Silver and black and something that looked like moonfire made solid. And her eyes, when Dorcas looked through them, could see more than physical space. Could see the threads of life and death, of magic and bond, of every connection that wove through the burning palace. Could see exactly where she needed to be. The wolf moved with speed that defied her size, flowing through flames that should have burned but somehow parted around her. She reached the eastern wing in heartbeats, following the life sense to where wolves were trapped behind collapsed stonework. Her jaws closed on support beams, hauling them aside with strength that came from somewhere beyond muscle. Her howl cut through chaos, giving the trapped wolves a beacon to follow, a promise that rescue was possible. They emerged, coughing and burned but alive, and Dorcas was already moving, racing to the next crisis, the next moment where death and life hung in balance. The archives where flame consumed irreplaceable history. She couldn't stop the fire, but she could sense which documents held the most crucial pack records, could grab them with careful jaws and carry them to safety. The foundations where wards were failing, she couldn't rebuild them alone, but she could find the wolves with enough magical sensitivity to help, could guide them to the anchor points, could show them through the bond what needed reinforcing. She was everywhere at once, or it felt that way, moving with precision born of seeing exactly where intervention mattered most. And through it all, she could feel Theron's presence through the mate bond. Feel his shock at her transformation, his fierce pride, his absolute trust that she would do the impossible, because that's what she'd been doing for 7 years. He kept Alara contained, prevented her from causing more destruction, held the line while Dorcas performed triage on a burning kingdom. But eventually, inevitably, Alara played her final card. The Blood Witch had been weakening, her stolen power exhausted, her physical form dying from the strain of the explosion she'd barely survived. But she'd kept one last reserve, one final trick. Her hand struck the ground, and the corrupted magic that had been seeping into the palace foundations for months, maybe years, suddenly activated. The territorial wards didn't just fail. They inverted, became weapons instead of protections, lashing out at every wolf within range. Pack bonds twisted, causing agonizing pain to anyone connected to Theron. The compelled wolves from earlier collapsed, their forced loyalty turning into psychic torment. And at the center of it all, Alara stood in a circle of her own blood, chanting words in a language that predated the common tongue. Trying to complete the ritual she'd planned for the bonding ceremony, but compressed into desperate minutes instead of careful hours. Trying to rip the alpha power from Theron and claim it for herself, consequences be damned. If she succeeded, every wolf in the kingdom would die. Their pack bonds would be severed violently, and the backlash would kill them as surely as severed arteries. Hundreds, maybe thousands of deaths, all to fuel Alara's grab for power she hadn't earned and couldn't properly wield. Dorcas felt it through her life sense, the thousands of threads about to be cut simultaneously, the catastrophic death toll approaching like a tidal wave. Felt Theron fighting to maintain the bonds, to protect his people, but he was just one wolf against magic that had been building for years. He needed help. Needed someone who could stand in the space between life and death and refuse to let the scales tip. Needed his mate. Dorcas crossed the burning palace in a silver blur, her wolf moving faster than thought. She could see the ritual circle, could sense its structure, could feel where Alara's magic was strongest and where it was vulnerable. The Blood Witch had been brilliant, patient, meticulous. But she'd made one critical miscalculation. She'd assumed the mate bond between Dorcas and Theron was still suppressed, still weak, still harvestable. Had built her entire ritual around siphoning that bond along with the alpha power. She hadn't accounted for what would happen when a death-touched Omega who'd been hiding her true strength for 7 years finally unleashed everything she was. Dorcas shifted mid-leap, returning to human form as she landed in the center of the ritual circle. Alara's eyes went wide with shock and fury, her chanting disrupted. But Dorcas wasn't there to fight. She was there to choose. Life. For Theron, for the pack, for the kingdom. For everyone except the wolf who'd spent years dealing death and calling it ambition. The mate bond blazed between Dorcas and Theron like a star going nova. Not suppressed, not weakened, but fully acknowledged and claimed and absolutely unbreakable. It anchored her as she reached for the inverted wards, for the corrupted pack bonds, for every thread Alara had twisted. Reached with her gift that finally made sense. She couldn't prevent death, but she could stand in its path and make it work for every inch of ground. The stolen lives that had been guiding her, teaching her, showing her the full scope of her power, they rose up like a tide. Not as ghosts, not as haunting, but as pure essence, as the fundamental force that said we were here, we mattered, we refused to let our deaths fuel more darkness. Dorcas became the conduit for that refusal, became the bridge between what Alara had taken and what the natural order demanded returned. The Blood Witch's magic shattered against the combined force of a fully realized mate bond and a gift that transcended simple death sense. Alara screamed, a sound of pure rage and disbelief. Her ritual collapsed, the stolen power backlashing through her own system. She'd built everything on harvested life force, had made herself dependent on others' energy. When that source was ripped away, when the magic reversed and demanded payment, her own life force wasn't nearly enough to cover the debt. The Blood Witch aged before their eyes. Years of stolen time, of extended life, of power that had kept her young and strong, all of it evaporated in seconds. She crumpled to ash and bone and finally nothing, consumed by the very magic she'd wielded with such calculated cruelty. The silence that followed was absolute. Then the palace groaned, and Dorcas realized her work wasn't finished. The wards were still broken, the foundations still compromised, the pack bonds still damaged. Alara's death had stopped the active threat, but the structural damage remained. She looked at Theron across the destroyed ritual circle. Saw him battered and bleeding but alive, saw him looking at her with something that transcended mere recognition. He saw her now. All of her. The girl he'd saved, the mate he'd missed, the Omega who'd loved him from shadows, the wolf who'd just saved his kingdom. Help me, she said, not aloud but through the bond. I can sense where everything's broken, but I need your strength to rebuild. He came to her without hesitation, his hands finding hers, his alpha power flowing through their connection. And together, with the mate bond as their foundation, they began reweaving what Alara had torn apart. It took hours. Painstaking, exhausting hours of finding each severed thread and coaxing it back to wholeness. Of reinforcing wards and calming pack bonds, and convincing the territorial magic that the crisis had passed, that stability could return. Other wolves helped Cashin and Marcus and council members who'd survived, pack members who'd been freed from compulsion. But it was Dorcas and Theron at the center, two halves of a whole, finally working in perfect synchronization. When dawn broke over the palace, the fires were extinguished. The wounded were being tended. The dead were being honored. And in the center of what had been the western wing, now open to the sky with walls collapsed and ceiling gone, the Alpha King and his mate stood surrounded by the pack they'd saved. Dorcas had never felt more exposed, more visible, more terrifyingly, wonderfully seen. And for the first time in her life, she didn't want to hide. 3 weeks later, Dorcas stood in the medicinal garden and felt the ghost of her old life like a half-remembered dream. The moonblooms were in full flower, their silver petals luminous in the dusk. The wolfsbane swayed in the evening breeze, still growing where she'd planted it years ago for tinctures she'd used to slowly poison herself. She should probably dig it up, remove the reminder of 7 years spent in self-destruction. But every time she reached for the trowel, something stopped her. Those plants had been part of her survival, twisted as that survival had been. They'd been her choice, her sacrifice, her way of loving when she'd believed love itself was dangerous. Removing them felt like erasing a chapter of her story she wasn't quite ready to forget. "You're thinking too loud," Theron said from behind her, his voice carrying affectionate exasperation. "I can feel the spiral through the bond." Dorcas smiled despite herself, leaning back against him as his arms came around her waist. The bond had stabilized over the past weeks, growing stronger as her wolf continued healing. She could feel him constantly now, not intrusively, but like a warmth in her chest that said you're not alone. You never have to be alone again. It still felt impossible some days. That she was here, acknowledged, claimed. That the pack called her Luna without hesitation. That she stood beside Theron in council meetings and strategic sessions and decisions that shaped the kingdom. That she'd gone from invisible to essential in the span of a single catastrophic night. I'm thinking about her, Dorcas admitted quietly. About how close she came to winning. About how many people died because I didn't see the truth sooner. You saw it exactly when you needed to. His chin rested on top of her head, solid and grounding. Any earlier and we wouldn't have had the proof, wouldn't have been able to root out all her collaborators. Any later and we'd be dead. You saved us, Dorcas. Saved me, saved the kingdom. You're allowed to accept that. Accepting it was harder than fighting had been. Dorcas had spent so long defining herself by sacrifice, by what she could endure, that being celebrated felt wrong somehow. The pack had wanted to throw a festival in her honor. She'd barely managed to convince them to wait until the rebuilding was further along. Wolves she'd never spoken to approached her with gratitude and awe, and she never knew what to do with their reverence. She wasn't a hero. She was just an Omega who'd been too stubborn to die when death would have been easier. You're doing it again, Theron murmured. Diminishing yourself. Refusing to see what everyone else sees when they look at you. And what's that? Strength. He turned her in his arms so they were face to face, his amber eyes intense in the fading light. Courage. The kind of power that doesn't need to announce itself because it simply is. You stood between the kingdom and annihilation, Dorcas. You walked into death itself and came back. That's not stubbornness. That's heroism. The words still didn't fit. Heroes were supposed to be fearless, flawless, certain. Dorcas was none of those things. She still woke from nightmares about the stolen lives, about the wolves who died before she understood her gift well enough to save them. Still felt guilt like a physical weight when she walked past the memorial garden where Alara's victims were honored. But maybe that was the point. Maybe heroes weren't the ones who felt no fear, they were the ones who fought despite being terrified. Who chose action over paralysis, who stood up when staying down would be safer. Maybe she'd been a hero all along in her own quiet way. Just one who'd been too focused on survival to notice. The council wants to formalize the Luna ceremony next month, Theron said, shifting to lighter topics. They've been remarkably patient, considering tradition says it should have happened within days of the bond being acknowledged. Tradition didn't account for having to rebuild half the palace and root out a Blood Witch conspiracy. Dorcas tried for levity, but nerves still fluttered in her stomach. A formal ceremony meant standing in front of hundreds of pack members, meant being the center of attention, meant accepting a role she still wasn't sure she deserved. You'll be magnificent, Theron said with absolute conviction. And if you're not ready, we'll wait. We'll wait years if that's what you need. You've spent enough of your life doing things on someone else's timeline. The understanding in his voice, the patience, the willingness to let her set the pace, it still surprised her sometimes. 7 years she'd watched him from the shadows, had built up an image of the Alpha King as untouchable, unknowable. 3 weeks of actually being with him had revealed someone far more human. Someone who had nightmares of his own, who doubted himself, who'd spent years lonely and searching for connection he couldn't name. They were both broken in their own ways. But somehow, the broken pieces fit together into something stronger than either of them had been alone. Next month is fine, Dorcas decided. The pack needs the stability. Needs to see that we're moving forward, that Alara didn't break us. She didn't even come close. His hand cupped her face, thumb brushing over her cheekbone in a gesture that had become familiar, cherished. We're here. We're whole. We're building something better than what existed before. It was true. The rebuilding wasn't just physical. The council had been restructured to include more diverse voices, more Omegas and lower-ranking wolves who'd proven their worth during the crisis. The pack laws around mate bonds and political marriages had been re-examined, strengthened to prevent another Alara from manipulating her way into power. They were creating something more resilient, more just, more conscious of the vulnerabilities that had nearly destroyed them. And at the center of it all, Dorcas was learning to use her gift the way it was meant to be used. Not to prevent every death that was impossible and trying had nearly broken her, but to stand in moments of crisis and tip the scales toward life when it mattered most. To be the kingdom's guardian in ways that honored both the gravity of her power and the limitations of being one wolf who couldn't save everyone. It was enough. She was enough. Some days she even believed it. The moon rose over the garden, full and luminous. In its light, the wolfsbane looked almost beautiful instead of deadly. A reminder that poison and medicine were often separated only by dosage and intention. That the same thing that could kill could also heal, if wielded with knowledge and care. Dorcas had been poisoning herself for 7 years. Now she was learning to be her own medicine. "I love you," she said, the words still new enough to feel daring. "I know I've loved you for years, but saying it out loud is different. Better. Like claiming something I thought I'd never be allowed to have." Theron's expression softened into something that made her chest ache with fullness. "I love you too. And I'm sorry I didn't see you sooner, didn't know what I was missing. But I see you now, Dorcas. Every day. Every moment. And I'm not looking away." He kissed her then, soft and reverent, and the mate bond hummed with contentment. This was what it should have been all along, partnership and choosing and love freely given instead of hidden in shadows. This was what she'd fought for, what she'd nearly died for, what she'd crawled back from death itself to claim. When they finally pulled apart, the garden was full dark, and stars had emerged overhead. Somewhere in the palace, life continued its complicated dance. Wolves healing, councils meeting, a kingdom rebuilding itself into something stronger. And at the center of it all, two mates who'd found each other despite impossible odds, despite prophecy and manipulation, and 7 years of silence. Dorcas looked up at the stars and thought about the girl she'd been 7 years ago, broken and dying in the woods, accepting death as her only future. Thought about what she'd tell that girl if she could reach back through time. "Hold on," she'd say. "I know it hurts. I know you think you're cursed. But there's a wolf who's going to find you, who's going to carry you to safety, who's going to give you a promise to hold on to. And 7 years from now, you'll stand in a garden and realize you were never cursed at all. You were being prepared. For love, for purpose, for a gift that will save hundreds of lives. The pain doesn't disappear, but it becomes part of something larger. Something that matters. So hold on. Just a little longer. I promise it's worth it." The wind rustled through the moonblooms, and for a moment, Dorcas could almost believe the girl in the woods heard her. Could almost feel time folding in on itself, past and present meeting in a space between, connected by a thread that refused to break. She'd been standing in the threshold her entire life. Between life and death, between curse and gift, between silence and claiming. And now, finally, she understood that the threshold wasn't a place of weakness. It was a place of power. The question had never been whether she was strong enough. It had been whether she was brave enough to believe in her own strength. The answer, hard-won and tested by fire, was yes. Would you have chosen her side? Would you have believed the Omega Girl with death in her eyes and love in her heart? Would you have seen past the curse to the gift underneath? Or would you have been like the villagers, like the pack who'd beaten her, like Alara who'd thought her easy prey? The truth is, we're all Dorcas sometimes. Standing in spaces between, carrying gifts that feel like curses, loving from shadows because claiming what we want feels too dangerous. We poison ourselves with silence and sacrifice and the belief that we're not enough, that we'll never be enough, that our love will somehow destroy what we're trying to protect. But what if the real prophecy isn't about becoming a blade? What if it's about becoming whole? What if the thing we fear most, being fully seen, fully known, fully claimed, is actually the thing that saves us? Dorcas chose to believe, chose to fight, chose life over death, love over fear, claiming over hiding. And in choosing, she became exactly what the kingdom needed. What would you become if you made the same choice? If this story lit something inside you, if you felt Dorcas's pain and celebrated her victory, if you believed in love that survives 7 years of silence and emerges stronger for the breaking, then subscribe to Cindy's Wolfheart Stories. Because here, we tell tales that burn. Stories of omegas who are anything but weak, of alphas who learn that strength means vulnerability, of love that transcends prophecy and fate, and every force that says it shouldn't exist. We tell stories about the threshold, about the wolves who stand between and refuse to choose death when life is still possible. We tell stories about you. Subscribe. Join the pack. Let us show you what it means to love fiercely, fight desperately, and claim the life you were always meant to live. The threshold is waiting. And so are we.